Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil, by Timothy Mitchell, narrated by Liam Gerrard. Preface to the 2023 edition. Carbon Democracy, 12 years later. A dozen years after carbon democracy first appeared, the question of oil and politics seems very different. The book was conceived not long after the United States and Britain invaded and occupied Iraq. Its publication at the end of 2011 coincided with the formal end of the US occupation. The failure of the war did not put a stop to the suffering the invading powers had brought to Iraq, or the political conflicts introduced and intensified by the occupation. But it did confirm the inadequacy of the ideas about oil and democracy which supporters of the invasion had employed to excuse it. The curse of Iraq was not, after all, its oil wealth. Controlling the oil was not vital to the democratic order of the West, and an army of occupation was not the instrument for teaching that kind of democracy to others. 12 years later, the question of carbon democracy appears in a new light. Iraq is not a threat to the US and its consumption of oil. Rather, oil is now the threat to the form of life that claimed to depend on its consumption. Democracy is not the end result of the growth of carbon-fueled prosperity and freedom, but a political order that seems paralyzed by the scale of the threat fossil fuels represent to the survival of a planet hospitable to human and non-human life. In 2010, when I was writing this book, humankind had a remaining carbon budget estimated at 910 gigatons of carbon dioxide. The budget refers to the additional quantity of greenhouse gases we can put in the atmosphere while keeping mean surface temperatures within 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. The limit offers a moderate chance of avoiding, or at least postponing, abrupt and irreversible changes in the climate system. In the dozen years that followed, to 2022, we consumed half of that remaining budget. Almost all countries have now committed to reducing net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060, but that is merely an aspiration. Most have failed to implement the policies to achieve it. Even an ambitious initiative like the US climate legislation of 2022, subsidizing the development of renewable energy, falls well short of the net zero pathway, in part because the electrical grid cannot expand fast enough to match a program based largely on corporate tax incentives to increase the supply of energy, rather than on measures to reduce demand. Having failed to adequately meet these commitments, and with the half remaining budget already spent, we will, at current rates of burning fossil fuels, use up the total greenhouse gas emissions compatible with a limit of 1.5 degrees, not by mid-century, but within a decade. The "we" here refers mainly to a small part of the world's population. Historically, Europe and North America, the first regions to industrialize, have produced half of the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. However, while we associate the growth in emissions with the transformation in industrial life since 1850, most of the excess carbon was produced quite recently. More than 80% of all fossil fuels burned since the start of the industrial age have been burned since 1960, and more than half of them in just the last 3 decades. While China has accounted for a large part of the recent increase, it is North America that remains the outlier. China, the rest of East Asia, Russia, Europe, and other large industrialized regions produce roughly similar quantities of greenhouse gases per capita, about 8 to 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Most countries of the global south produce from half to a quarter of that quantity per person, and some far less. The United States and Canada, on the other hand, consume around 20 tons per person per year, or double the amount of other large industrialized countries. Organized by country, these per capita figures conceal another inequality. Today, the disparity in emissions lies not only between countries and regions, but, increasingly, within them. In most regions of the world, the top 10% of the population by income is responsible for more than 3/4 of the carbon emissions. The bottom 50% of the population of North America, for example, produces less than 1/6 of the emissions per person of the top 10%. The ratio in Europe is similar. In both regions, over the 3 decades from 1990 to 2019, those in the poorest half of the population appear to have reduced their per capita emissions by 25 to 30%, probably due to their decreased wages and consumption combined with the effect of national climate policies. As a result, that half of the population in both regions is already on course to meet the 2030 per capita emissions targets compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming. The richest 10%, on the other hand, would have to reduce their contribution to emissions by more than 80% to reach the same benchmark. The challenge facing democratic politics today appears to be an inability to take into account the interests of future generations, or even of the near future. The obstacle is particularly marked in the United States, which combines the highest levels of per capita consumption of fossil fuels among large industrialized countries with historically the greatest intransigence towards the transition away from their use. And this, in turn, is combined with increasing inequality, in which a privileged minority of the population accounts for an ever greater share of that excess, and for the accompanying intransigence. How does the understanding of energy politics developed in Carbon Democracy help us think about the present challenge? Let me recap certain themes from the book. A first step is to avoid the problem of energy determinism, where the expanding consumption of fossil fuels is explained as an inevitable aspect of the long development of industrial society. Not only was very little excess carbon generated before the 1960s, compared to what has been produced since, but the extraordinary quantities of oil and gas the West has consumed since then was not something on which it depended as a natural feature of its industrial life. Those carbon-heavy ways of living were engineered in the design of overweight vehicles, the car-centered layout of cities and suburbs, inefficient standards for the use of energy in buildings, the reliance on synthetic chemicals and heavy machinery in farming, and other paths that were adopted partly to develop and sustain an excessive consumption of hydrocarbons. The latest threat to the dependence of the West on fossil fuels, the cutting of gas supplies to Europe in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, illustrates the engineered form of this dependence. While the interruption to supplies caused considerable short-term hardship, especially in countries such as Britain, where the government refused to manage the shortage, Europe quickly adapted to alternative supplies. It was predicted that in the following year alone, the generation of power from renewables would increase by 20%. Second, oil politics involved not just creating this dependence on carbon-based energy. The dependence was itself a means of weakening demands for more democratic and less unequal societies. The book explores this by drawing a historical comparison between coal and oil. Surprisingly, while oil can be associated with the weakening of democracy, dependence on coal seemed not to be an impediment to democratic politics, but the factor that made mass democracy itself possible. This happened not simply because, as historians have argued, coal fueled an industrial revolution, creating new social forces that fought for improvements in collective life, but for a more specific reason. The widespread use of coal, and especially its use to generate electricity, created countries almost entirely dependent on a single, concentrated source of energy. That dependence was a cause of vulnerability, a vulnerability to political disruption. It gave those who produced the coal and transported it a critical ability to interrupt the supply. For the first time in history, workers could make political demands backed by the power to shut down an entire energy system. That power and those demands gave rise, from the late 19th through the mid-20th centuries, to modern mass democracy. Thus, the book resituates the problem of democracy in terms of an ability to interrupt or sabotage the flow of carbon energy. The political potential of oil was quite different. It is liquid, so producing it did not require sending large workforces underground. Moved across oceans in tankers, the supply of oil was easy to reroute when political disruption was threatened. For these and other reasons, It was harder for the workers themselves to interrupt the supply of energy, and to use such interruptions to build political demands. In addition, moving from the politics of coal to the politics of oil meant moving historically from the first fossil fuel to the second. That sequence created a new spatial relationship. Industrial democracy came into being close to the sources of coal, creating a tight connection between energy production and politics. Oil was to be largely consumed in those same industrial centres, but, unlike coal, it was mostly produced elsewhere. Its supply was stretched out over much longer distances, separating the place of production from the main sites of consumption, making it harder for those who produced oil to build alliances with those who transported it and handled it at the point of consumption. So it is not just that oil was different technically and harder to interrupt, sabotage and build democratic arrangements around, but it was also now spread out over much larger imperial networks of production, distribution and use. With oil, the potential for sabotage moved out of the hands of those who used it to advance democratic demands into the hands of large shareholder-owned and state-owned corporations. In fact, the multinational corporation came into being as a way of conducting a different kind of sabotage. Oil companies organized the restriction and interruption of supplies not to advance political demands for more egalitarian and democratic collective life, but to make financial demands for extraordinary levels of profit. Oil shaped the possibilities for democracy in another way, one that is especially important for climate politics. As the book explores, the rapid rise in oil production in the second half of the 20th century coincided with a transformation in the way the industrialized states of the North Atlantic world governed their populations. The change was marked by the emergence of a novel object of government, the economy. During and after the Second World War, statisticians and economic planners developed new methods of estimating the total production of goods and services within a country, and of picturing the way in which the payment of wages and the purchasing of products circulated income between households and businesses. They began to measure this circulation of funds as what came to be known as GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, and to describe the totality they were measuring as the economy. They estimated the size of this new object in a way that included some costs, but excluded others, and that counted as benefits many things that might be experienced as burdens, including the increasing cost of monopoly rents and interest charges. These forms of exclusion and calculation created an object that could be seen to grow in size from one year to the next. This helped create a politics of growth, in which the increasing size of the economy was mistaken for a measure of progress and well-being. Gradually, the imperative of economic growth could be used as a political means to explain away the problem of inequality, social impoverishment, and, by the 1970s, the increasing unaffordability of improved wages or extended leisure or adequate housing and healthcare. How can the analysis of energy politics, developed here, help us understand the transformation now finally gathering momentum towards modes of living based on renewable energy? Will the end of coal and hydrocarbons bring an end to so-called energy wars? Will the switch to means of generating power that are more widely distributed, and that can be locally controlled, create the possibility of a more democratic future, where access to social goods and protections is less unequal? There is no straightforward answer. The mode of supplying energy can open up political opportunities, but does not, in itself, determine the form of politics. The analysis in this book draws attention to three factors that will affect the political possibilities of the energy transition. First, in whose hands will the production and distribution of energy be placed? Will it be in the control of private corporations, state energy firms, or municipal and local agencies and cooperatives? It is not necessarily the case that the small-scale, distributed production of energy is somehow more democratizing than production on a larger scale. After all, before the rise of fossil fuels, the production of energy was much smaller in scale and more widely distributed, with energy provided by farmland, forests, animal and human labor, and rivers. That was not a more democratic age. even if it did not enable the organization of forms of oppression on the scale that fossil fuels eventually allowed. Rather, the question that matters is who is accountable for controlling the supply of energy, and what points of vulnerability allow that accountability to be enforced. Second, will the production of renewable energy be organized in ways that can free us from being governed through the economy? As this book explores, the development of economic ideas has been closely tied to the history of fossil fuels. The phenomenal expansion of oil consumption after the middle of the 20th century coincided with and enabled the invention of the economy. The measurement and management of its growth operated as an index of well-being and a mode of circumscribing political possibilities. This economic rationality depended on specific ways of counting and discounting the use of energy, the exhaustion of non-renewable resources, and the imposition of debt, shareholder claims, and other burdens on future generations. This drive to enjoy wealth in the present threatens the stability of Earth systems and the survival of many species of life. The transition away from the carbon age and the forms of ecological destruction and species extinction that have accompanied it is often said to require a new form of green growth, or even degrowth. These are important questions, but are not always framed in ways that break with the modes of thought carbon energy has shaped. Freeing ourselves from the economy requires a better understanding of how the idea of the economy and its growth have enabled us to live at the expense of the future. Third, for what purpose will the production of future energy be capitalized? Compared to many other capital projects, energy infrastructure provides an especially long-lived and predictable flow of payments to those who control the apparatus of production and distribution. In the age of oil, for example, this longevity allowed multinational petroleum companies to become, for many decades, the largest businesses on the planet. Their size came about not because oil required vastly larger corporate organizations compared to other major industries, but because the future earnings sold to investors in the present in the form of shares in the corporation, meaning claims to its future profits, were so much larger and longer in scale. The political and technical durability of the energy infrastructure, and the extraordinarily large claims on future revenue this durability enabled, allowed giant oil firms to operate as a powerful mode through which a minority prospers at the expense of the future majority. Instead of reducing the cost of energy as the investment in infrastructure is paid off, the shareholder corporation encumbers all future users of energy with the burden of paying the claims of those who purchased shares in those anticipated payments. How will the encumbering of the future be organized under the energy transition? A more democratic and equitable energy system would allow the capitalization only of the mechanisms necessary to supply power, not of the future revenue that would flow long after those costs are paid off. Democracy and social justice, in other words, depend not only on the control of resources today, but on limits to the apparatuses of credit that give shareholders and other power holders in the present a control over revenues in the future. But that is the subject for another book. Timothy Mitchell, May 2023. Introduction. Fossil fuels helped create both the possibility of modern democracy and its limits. To understand the limits, this book begins by exploring what made the emergence of a certain kind of democratic politics possible, the kind I call carbon democracy. Before turning to the past, however, let me explain some of the contemporary limits I have in mind. In the wake of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, one of those limits was widely discussed. A distinctive feature of the Middle East, it has often been said, is its lack of democracy. For many who write about the region, this lack has something to do with oil. Countries that depend upon petroleum resources for a large part of their earnings from exports tend to be less democratic. The wave of uprisings that spread across the Arab world in 2011 appeared to confirm this relationship between large oil earnings and the difficulty of mounting claims to a more democratic and egalitarian life. By and large, The less oil a country produced, and the faster its production was declining, the more readily the struggles for democracy unfolded. Tunisia and Egypt, where the uprisings began, and Yemen, Bahrain and Syria, where they quickly spread, were among the region's smallest oil producers, and in all of them the production of oil was declining. Of the 8 large producers in the Middle East, only in Libya, the smallest producer among them, and where production had also suffered a recent decline, did a similar political struggle gain momentum, although the conflict in the Libyan case was the quickest to collapse into violence and foreign intervention. Most of those who write about the question of the oil curse, as the problem is sometimes called, have little to say about the nature of oil and how it is produced, distributed and used. They discuss not the oil, but the oil money, the income that accrues after the petroleum is converted into government revenue and private wealth. The reasons they offer for the anti-democratic properties of petroleum focus on this surplus revenue. It gives governments the resources to repress dissent, buy political support, or relieve pressures for a more equal sharing of prosperity with public handouts and price subsidies. The explanations have nothing to do with the ways in which oil is extracted, processed, shipped and consumed, the powers of oil as a concentrated source of energy, or the apparatus that turns this fuel into forms of affluence and power. They treat the oil curse as an affliction only of the governments that depend on its income, not of the processes by which a wider world obtains the energy that drives its material and technical life. Ignoring the apparatus of oil production reflects an underlying conception of democracy. This is the conception shared by an American expert on democracy sent to southern Iraq, 9 months after the US invasion of 2003, to discuss capacity building with the members of a provincial council. "Welcome to your new democracy," he said, as he began displaying PowerPoint slides of the administrative structure the Americans had designed. "I have met you before. I have met you in Cambodia. I have met you in Russia. I have met you in Nigeria." At which point, we are told, 2 members of the council walked out. For an expert on democracy, democratic politics is fundamentally the same everywhere. It consists of a set of procedures and political forms that are to be reproduced in every successful instance of democratization, in one variant or another, as though democracy occurs only as a carbon copy of itself. Democracy is based on a model, an original idea, that can be copied from one place to the next. If it fails, as it seems to in many oil states, the reason must be that some part of the model is missing or malfunctioning. An idea is something that is somehow the same in different places, that can be repeated from one context to another, freeing itself from local histories, circumstances and material arrangements, becoming abstract, a concept. An expert in democracy has to make democracy into an abstraction, something that moves easily from place to place, so that he can carry it in his suitcase or his PowerPoint presentation from Russia to Cambodia, from Nigeria to Iraq, showing people how it works. Once one has made democracy into something that moves around the world as an idea, in order to move with it, one is committed to a particular way of explaining how the idea works, how people become democratic. If democracy is an idea, then countries become democratic by the idea getting into people's heads. The problem of democracy becomes a question of how to manufacture a new model of the citizen, one whose mind is committed to the idea of democracy. A central theme in discussions of the contemporary Middle East in the United States has been the question of how to manufacture new kinds of citizen. In debates about the war in Iraq, economic reform, the future of Palestine, political Islam, obstacles to democratization, the spread of anti-Americanism, and the 2011 uprisings, one finds a recurrent interest in the question of how to produce a new kind of political agent. How can one create subjects of power who are adequately equipped to impose limits on authority? How does one form a citizenry that refuses to authorize authoritarianism? What kinds of education, enlightenment, training or experience are required to engender forms of economy based on agents who act according to their rational self-interest, rather than corruption or cronyism? What produces forms of politics based on mutual trust and respect for opponents, rather than suspicion and repression? In short, these debates ask, how can people learn to recognize themselves and respond as subjects of new forms of power? What forms of power, conversely, can engineer the liberal or democratic political subject? There has been plenty of criticism of the way these questions have been posed and answered, especially in the debates about democratization, often faulting them for ignoring the so-called larger forces at work. American writings on the problem of democracy in the Middle East typically have little to say about capitalist globalization and the work being done to turn people into the docile workers and willing consumers required to solve economic crises in the West, about the forces of empire, for whom democratization schemes are a minor diplomatic part of wider efforts to shore up a weakening hegemony, and about the tools of violence and repression that occupying powers and military regimes deploy. Such criticisms, however, overlook what is interesting in these debates, the notion that democracy is an engineering project, concerned with the manufacture of new political subjects and with subjecting people to new ways of being governed. Take a recent example of research on democratization in the Middle East, the Arab Barometer Project. The project carried out opinion surveys in 5 Arab countries in order to measure the presence of individual attitudes and orientations that might be conducive to the establishment of democracy. These orientations include political tolerance, respect for diversity, civic engagement, and interpersonal trust. The project was funded, initially, by the Middle East Partnership Initiative of the U.S. Department of State, and governed by a board that includes scholars from each of the countries whose political culture the project seeks to measure and record. The Arab Barometer Project forms part of a wider initiative called the Global Barometer, which carries out similar research in Africa, Latin America, and other regions. The Arab version, along with a number of similar surveys of the region, has published results of opinion surveys that claimed to put in question many of the prevailing assumptions in official circles in the United States about political attitudes in the Arab world. Whatever the usefulness of showing us some of the limits of official discourse, the project seems at first sight to suffer from a weakness that affects much of the research on questions of democratization and civil society. It appears to be looking for what one might call democracy without democratization. The premise of the project is that successful democratization requires a citizenry that values democracy and possesses the elements of a democratic political culture. Yet there is no reliable evidence, as far as I am aware, that the presence of a civic culture, attitudes of trust, tolerance, mutual respect, and other liberal virtues facilitates the emergence of democracy. There is, in fact, no shortage of historical evidence to suggest the opposite. One can find repeated examples in the history of democratic struggles in the West of tolerant, educated, liberal political classes who were opponents of democratization, fighting to prevent the extension of effective political rights to those who did not own property, to religious and racial minorities, to women, and to colonial subjects. In many cases, the civic virtues that dominant political classes possessed provided the grounds on which to oppose democratization. Their own civility and reasonableness, they often claimed, qualified them to act as spokespersons for the interests of those who were not yet ready to speak for themselves. Once democratic rights have been achieved, their exercise may encourage the development of virtuous civic attitudes, at least among members of the expanded political class, virtues whose inculcation and practice become a mode through which people subject themselves to democratic authority. Democratization, on the other hand, has often been a battle against those attitudes. It has required a more intransigent set of engagements and practices. This book is concerned with those more intransigent engagements, and with the ways in which carbon energy helped manufacture forms of agency capable of effective intransigence. I began writing the book because I wanted a better understanding of the relations between democracy and oil. Initially, like everyone else, I thought of oil as one thing and democracy as another.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?